Skylanders was a series that was, at one point, the source of heated discussion, both positive and negative. While longtime Spyro fans were pissed for various reasons, the series was a massive success, with kids going batshit insane for these figures and adult collectors paying exorbitant prices for some of the harder to find ones during the initial hype. Just mentioning the word Skylanders to anyone who was a parent in the early 2010s is probably enough to give them more flashbacks of having to hunt for these things for their kids. However, with how much technology has progressed in the 12 years since Spyro's adventure, it may be hard to imagine why there was so much fervor around these dinky plastic toys. The once novel technology used for Skylanders, RFID, is now commonplace, being used in transit systems and even for contactless payment. Unfortunately, it's this passage of time that makes people overlook the technical ingenuity of these games. With Skylanders' indefinite hiatus and loss in popularity, many brush it off as a flash-in-the-pan fad. Moreover, some Spyro fans are still angry about the series' inclusion of Spyro to this day, and we all know Spyro fans can make people feel the fear of God. But there is an upside. Back when these games were new, the developers had to be coy about the technology being used, saying that it was magic.
I still remember with the first game, we didn't want to talk about really the technology that went into it, and just wanted to present the magic. And I still remember people getting really upset, going, "Yeah, well, how's it work?" I'm like, "Oh, it's magic. Clearly, it's you put it on there and they come to life." No. Like, what's in it? Like, how do you do what's going on? And having almost getting into fights because it was so magical.
Every Skylander.
But now that the dust is settled, the developers have been more open about the tech employed in Skylanders and the hurdles they faced developing it. One of the more interesting topics they delved into was the development of the Portal of Power, the magical vessel that transported your Skylanders into the game. And in this video, we'll be discussing said development, how the portal works, and the portal's various iterations. Development on what would become the Portal of Power began in 2009, when Skylanders was a different project called Spyro's Kingdom, in which Spyro wasn't a playable character but a fully grown dragon and the ruler of a kingdom. However, the idea of the portal came even before Spyro's Kingdom, during a time where Skylanders developer Toys for Bob were experimenting with peripherals for the Wii. This was back when the Wii craze was in full effect, with an absurd amount of peripherals being made for it. From the Wii Fit board and the Wii wheel to the Wii cooking kit. Perfect for playing Hell's Kitchen on the Wii with your buddies.
Come here, you fat-mouthed little stupid bitch.
The brains behind the portal was Toys for Bob software engineer Robert Leyland, a guy with a long history in the game industry, let alone working with Toys for Bob, having worked on games like Toe Jam and Earl and TFB's cult favorite series, Star Control. Robert and TFB experimented with a variety of ideas, with some of the quirkier ones including a game involving hats and players using a peripheral to balance an egg on their heads.
Right, so you said like you had the idea of like a hat on your head kind of thing, an egg on your head. Was that the idea? Was it an actual physical hat on your head, or?
Yes, there was a.
Okay, so what was that? How is that going to work in the game?
Oh, it was pre Spyro, pre Skylanders. We were kind of just thinking, brainstorming. There was another one involving hatching an egg. That you'd have like this football thing. I mean, that you're talking about something that's like 10 plus years ago, and that only I think we thought about it for less than a few days. It's like,
right.
No, work. But the idea that you might have to wear a hat while playing a game seemed kind of silly and fun, and maybe you aimed with it or something. Well, who knows? I actually don't remember. There was something. I do remember there was something about balancing. You had to balance the hat on your head, I think.
However, none of these ideas stuck, with development on them typically lasting a few days before being scrapped. Things seemed uncertain, at least until Toys for Bob realized the idea they were looking for was right under their noses.
At Toys for Bob, one of the wonderful things about working there was, if you had an interest in something, they were pretty supportive about exploring it. And so we had after-work hobby sessions and things like that. And one of the after-work hobby sessions, a group of people who were making these toys in molds. And, we were people who like playing fantasy role-playing games and, Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. They were making little wizards. There was this weird squid guy that Errol made, and I can't even remember them all, but some of them actually did turn into Skylanders.
According to Robert, Toys for Bob held after-work hobby sessions, and one of their hobbies was making figures for fantasy role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. The ties between Skylanders and D&D are a story for another day, as the series is heavily influenced by D&D, and Toys for Bob even featured talent who worked on early D&D. Some of the TFB staff who made these figures were character designer Ai Wei Huang, the madman who went on to design countless Skylanders, concept artist Irene Chan, the Chad who did a ton of environmental and object designs for the Skylanders games, and illustrator Errol Otis, an absolute beast who was one of the most prolific early artists for Dungeons & Dragons. But perhaps the most influential of these model makers was the head of Toys for Bob himself, Paul Reich.
And I had made plastic toys and rubber monsters as a hobbyist for fun. So I knew the basics of making molds and casting, and I taught that to Iway and some other people. And that's when we created this little production line on our office counter where we were just crafting toy after toy after toy. And then we had a little, the artists. And these are artists who are like animators or environment 3D artists, but they all had traditional art training, so they were able to paint toys, and it was really fun.
Paul was somebody already hyper-fixated on creating his own toys, having done model casting as a hobby for years. So when Robert told him about the possibility of RFID over lunch, the idea of combining toys with RFID stuck with him. And since Toys for Bob needed an idea for a Wii accessory, the team figured that they could incorporate their toys into a game using RFID. Robert, eager for a chance to revisit his hobby in electronics, was up to the task of making it work. I've been talking a lot about RFID, but what is it? RFID, short for radio frequency identification, is essentially a wireless system using readers and tags. Readers are devices with one or more antennas that send out radio waves and receive signals back from the tags. Tags, in turn, use these radio waves to share their identity and other information with nearby readers. In Skylanders' case, the reader is the portal of power and the RFID tags are in the figures themselves. Robert and Iway have gone into detail about this in interviews, but the portal has a metal coil at its bottom. This coil is able to transfer energy to a smaller coil in the RFID tags on the figures. These tags contain information about the figure. For example, what edition the figure is, Series 2, 3, etc., and color variations like Dark Spyro or Punch Pop Fizz are hard-coded onto the tag. But then there's read-write information which can be changed. These include things like your Skylanders nickname, the amount of challenges they've completed, their level, and what upgrade path the player selected. That's getting ahead of ourselves because the portal didn't become like this overnight. In fact, Robert's earliest prototype for the portal looked dramatically different from what you may recognize.
The early prototypes used a printed circuit board that we got from a company in Turkey, bare bits of wire. There's photos of some of the stuff, and we had them on back-to-back paper plates, and somebody had an inverted cup over one. I've got one where we used a bit of plumbing pieces to create for lighting effects. There was a lot of cobbling together.
That's right, the magical, whimsical Portal of Power was initially prototyped with paper plates. Other early Portal prototypes used plumbing pipes and whatever else the TFB gang could get their hands on. As for the toys, the team would sculpt them out of Sculpey, create rubber molds from the sculptures, hand paint them, and then attach RFID tags to each one. According to Iway, in an interview with Magazine, they showed Activision an early prototype of the portal. He explained, "This was the kind of thing we had to create internally to prove to ourselves that we weren't crazy. If you just imagine Skylanders as a pitch on paper, I don't think it would have been very successful. But as soon as we made the first handmade Sculpey figure and put it in our hands, it started to make sense. Then, having a working portal where you could place a character on it and immediately see it running around a simple world on a screen. That's all we needed to sell the idea, and we had that very early on. The Activision suits loved it so much that snatching up the prototype toys became a regular occurrence. While this was a bit obnoxious for the TFB team at the time, it ended up working in their favor in the long run.
Basically, we would mold them and paint them and attach an RFID tag to them and send them down to Activision with the first prototypes of the game. And kind of an odd story happened. The toys would go down with the prototype, but they would never come back. We would get this. We'd say, "Look, can we get the toys back, please? Because we're still working on the development stuff." And it was like, "Oh yeah, we'll get those back to you right away," kind of thing. What we didn't know, and that happened probably 3 or 4 times, and to the point where Paul, our studio head, was kind of unwilling to let them go at the meetings, to leave them there. He wanted to bring them back because we kept having to make new ones. And that they took quite a bit of effort to hand paint them and all this kind of stuff. And what we didn't know was that several of the Activision executives had taken some of the toys home to show their kids, to get their kids' reaction to them. And of course, once they'd shown the toys to the kids didn't want to let them go. And, as your parent, you've given your kid a toy, you are not going to take it back. That's just not going to work. And in a sense, those kids became our best salespeople. That reaction of the kids playing with it, getting the experience of putting it into the game, and the executives at Activision, the head of finance, the head of the creative head, they all had kids in the right age range for Skylanders. They became our best salesmen.
The exec's enthusiasm translated into strong backing and resources for the project, which helped turn Skylanders from a wild idea into a full-blown reality. Once TFB got the go-ahead from Activision, they continued refining the Portal's technology, but they weren't doing it alone. While Robert and the team were tech wizards, they still needed help to make the Portal meet consumer product regulations. Fortunately, this wasn't Activision's first experience in creating plastic toys, as they had acquired Red Octane, the studio behind manufacturing Guitar Hero, back in 2007. With all that background in place, let's dive into the first design for the Portal. And we're not talking about the Spyro's Adventure Portal just yet. Remember how I mentioned that Skylanders originally started out as a project called Spyro's Kingdom? Well, that project had its own version of the Portal. The first time this portal was publicly shown was in concept art featuring an adult Spyro sitting on it like a throne. Its ornate design led TFB to nickname it the Jewel Box Portal. In September 2018, TFB donated a physical sample of this Jewel Box Portal to the Strong Museum of Play. Although the sample at the museum didn't show this feature, the early portals were actually designed to plug into the Wii remote rather than the console itself, a design that didn't last long, as playtesting showed this to be very inconvenient.
The earliest portals like that all plugged into the bottom of a Wiimote.
So you had the early portals plugging into the Wii remote?
Yes, the earliest portals, the portals that we did the first year or year and a half of development, maybe almost 2 years of development, literally plugged into the bottom of a Wiimote.
Wow. So I imagine that there was probably some reason why you decided to change that. Probably for the play testing, having to have the portal plugged into the Wii remote all the time might have not been as great feeling as it maybe could have been.
Yeah, people tend to shake their Wiimotes around, particularly since the game called on you to do that, and the little cable would tug and the portal would fall over and your toy would disconnect, and there were lots of reasons not to do it.
Thankfully, Toys for Bob avoided the ruining of many Christmases caused by kids sending their portals flying and smashing into bits on the ground. More about the Jewel Box Portal was also shown in 2021, when Toys for Bob revealed the prototype for Spyro's Kingdom. The portal works differently in this build, with players being able to select their Skylanders and items from a menu. Some other early portals included one featuring the symbols for each of the 8 elements, and an all-black portal that was more function than form. However, this latter portal was closer to resembling its final version, and interestingly enough, some of these black portals would even be used to demo the game. Whatever the case, the portal, like Spyro's Kingdom itself, would go through some massive changes. This leads us into the familiar portal of power for Spyro's Adventure. To simplify things, I'll be lumping the portals for each game into 2 categories. The ones that worked for Nintendo and Sony consoles, and the ones that worked for Xbox consoles. The former used a Bluetooth adapter to connect to consoles, while the latter connected with a wire. The wired approach would be used for all portals in the future, save for the 3DS portals, but Bluetooth was initially used at the request of Activision.
But our engineering design, basically our game design, pretty much needed to use USB as the connector. We wanted to do wireless. There was a big debate internally about wired versus wireless. Activision's marketing really wanted us to use wireless as well, and we did a lot of design work with the people at Red Octane on making the portal be manufacturable, wireless, and NFC compliant.
Thanks to TFB's brilliant software engineers like Dan Gerstein, the magic moment of placing a figure onto the portal is really quick and snappy. Moreover, the color of the portal corresponds to the element of the Skylander you use, like blue for water or orange for tech. In an interview with the Portalcasters podcast, Robert explained how this was achieved.
2 things that we really wanted. One is we wanted that sense of magic, particularly the coming to life moment when your toy appeared in the game. In fact, the game code, the subroutine that handles that Dan Gerstein wrote and developed for months, was called the magic moment. And that was the moment the toy appeared in the game. We needed it to be really easy, very simple for kids to use, and very fast. Those were things. That was the overriding consideration. So we wanted the moment that you put the toy into the game to be absolutely magical. And Spyro's Adventure, we feel like we really nailed that it felt so good to put your toy into the game. Even the order that the data is arranged on the tag was set up so that we could load data as the tag was being read. We would load data in and use it to animate the magic moment. So the very first pieces of data that come in are the toy type, some color scheme, and the element, and a couple of other things like that, so that we can set up that magic moment really fast.
Dan Gerstein would go into further detail in a Reddit AMA, claiming, "The portal itself, just on the game scripting side, went through more iterations than you might imagine. We made gigantic flowcharts for what if X happens. We tried to think of and handle everything. What if the player added too many toys? toys? What if a toy's memory ran out of write cycles? What if the player removed the toy mid-load, and how could we respond as fast as possible? I treated the portal like an additional input device, like a controller, and tried to make it as responsive as possible. Early versions had a 2-second delay before even reacting to a toy being there, but we knew players would have the most fun if it really felt as instantaneous as possible, reacting to the presence or absence of a toy. The difference between a second and half-second, or even a quarter of a second, was huge here. Just on Spyro's adventure alone, I rewrote the portal logic 3 times. In future games, I worked with Robert Leyland to optimize just how quickly we could load enough information from the toy to make the game respond, using the portal sequence to load information only as it went along. I had to teach our QA testers how to be a portal jerk, as I called it, putting on and removing random toys as much as possible. I didn't expect players to be well behaved and didn't want players to break their game because a toy fell off or they were being kids and having fun playing with their toy collection. The portal really was like a controller with a million buttons, and most games didn't have to deal with that. In case you couldn't tell, I really loved and cared about that portal. I could talk about it forever, and it was the hardest thing to do by far. When it comes to reading tags, the first Portal of Power was only able to read 4 RFID tags in total. This isn't surprising as it's only the portal for the first game. The most figures that would be on there would be 2 along with a magic item. The portal also features a green ring near the bottom. The reason for this, according to Robert, was to match the green bases on the figures. Had they continued to use this style of portal, the color would have been changed for each game, depending on the colors of the Skylanders bases. However, this idea would be scrapped by the second game, Giants. Speaking of which... Alright, so the Skylanders Giants are aesthetically very similar to the Spyro's Adventure Portal. However, that green base was replaced with a clear base instead. For those who always wondered why the base wasn't orange to match the base of the Giants figures, there's actually a reason. According to Robert, Activision chose this so that the portals could be reused for future games.
The design we came up with, we wanted it to match the toys to some extent, which is why it has the ring light on it, and the early ones, the Spyro's Adventure ones, have the green ring on them, because that green ring was to match the green fluorescent bases on the Skylanders, on the toys. And we didn't know how many years we'd be able to do Skylanders, but by the time we got to doing the bases, we knew we were going to do a second edition. We were going to do Giants, and we'd already picked orange as our second color. I actually have in my basement portals with green rings and orange rings, because we were going to do the Giants portals with orange rings. They eventually decided to go with gray rings because they wanted to be able to use the same portal for future games, which didn't happen, but that's the decision that was made at the time.
This ultimately wouldn't pan out, and not for the reasons you may think, because the software in the Giants portal actually had a major upgrade from the SSA portal, but we'll be getting more into that in a little bit. Additionally, by the time they were working on Giants, 3D printing began to become more integrated when prototyping the toys. However, one of the most significant gimmicks added to Giants was the use of LEDs in some of the figures, including the eponymous Giants and the Light Core subset. You may notice that this feature works on all portals, including the original Spyro's portal. The reason for this is that the RFID reader, in addition to communicating with the tag, also transfers power to it. While communicating with the tag is the main goal, there's also an excess of power that can be used to power other things. In an interview with Teal the Game Master, Rob detailed how the initial experimentation for Light Core came about, with it not intentionally being done for use in toys, but for testing if the portals worked.
Getting the toys to light up and glow, just using the generated power from the portal, that was probably the funnest, one of the funnest things we did. There's something absolutely magical about the toys, because they first appeared in Giants. The Giants themselves glowed, and then we had little toys, and it was kind of a happenstance event. What had happened was we were testing portals, and I needed a really quick way to determine if the portal was turned on or not, and if the software was actually turning on the field. So a little bit of technical background. The RFID tag is not actually a radio. It's called radio frequency identification, right? Or radio frequency identification device, something like that. The radio frequency just refers to the signal frequency, but it's not actually a radio. It's actually a transformer. And okay, how am I going to explain this? Essentially, it's a power transfer device. It's like a wireless charger. You know how you can get wireless chargers these days. Toss your phone down on and charges it by inductive coupling. Basically, a little electromagnet in the bottom sends power to a little electromagnet in the phone, and that's actually how RFID works. It actually transfers power to the RFID chip and communicates with it at the same time. But the communication is on RFID is what they really want. but wireless chargers do the same sort of communication. And so since there was this extra excess power, I figured I could just make a little circuit that would make an LED glow, and I did use that to determine if the portals were on or off. If I remember right, there was some bug where the portal would stop recognizing toys, so and it was because the power was being turned off to the portal, not the portal itself, but to the antenna of the portal. And I was working on this and showing it, and I showed it to Iwe and said, "Hey, look, I can make this thing glow, and look how far away it can glow." And Iwe goes, "Can we put that in a toy?" I went, "Yeah, I think we could." And we got our favorite toy for doing experiments, which was Prison Break. Prison Break was the toy, the most excellent toy for doing crazy experiments on, because he was pretty easy to disassemble, and we had a little hospital ward of broken Prison Breaks that we quite literally butchered to make other toys with. And we built an LED into each arm, each of his prism arms, and glued wire to the outside of them, and painted it and like molded over it, and then down into the base where a tiny little piece of electronics was, to make him glow. And he glowed and the tag, and could read the tag at the same time. And that actually was kind of a little bit tricky, but it worked out okay. And we showed this to people, and it was like, oh my gosh, we've got to do that. And that happened, I would say, probably towards the end of the Spyro's Adventure development. We were probably 3/4 of the way through Spyro's Adventure, and the Light Core idea came up, and Activision was at that point already talking to us about doing a sequel, and said, okay, we'll include it in the next generation. And it went from an idea into development in probably less than 6 months. It went from a concept to being built into the toys within 6 months, which is kind of amazing, but and really fun. I mean, so much fun to play with these toys and have them do this magical, like, glow thing.
This would push the team to experiment even further with what the portal could power in future games, and turned Robert and Iwe into a mad scientist duo. Now that we covered how Light Core works, it's time to move on to one of the most technologically ambitious games in the series. Skylanders Swap Force, a game whose gimmick is still incredibly impressive to this day. The development of these figures is a story worthy for a whole video in itself, with Swap Force going through various incarnations, the most infamous being Skylanders Shapeshifters. Although Robert wasn't involved with the software side of Swap Force, due to the game being developed by Vicarious Visions, he was involved with the engineering of the Swap Force figures. According to Robert, the communication of Swap Force figures is done between 2 coils in the base of the character and 1 in the upper half. One coil goes to the RFID tag in the base of the figure, and another goes to a ferrite coil in an electrical junction. Then the upper half has another matching ferrite coil, and they just need to be lined up with each other. To achieve this, the swappers use 2 magnets, one north and one south, that causes the characters to rotate into the right position, and the ferrite transformer is lined up so it can read the tag in the upper part of the swapper. Robert stated that's how the game knows which pairs are which pairs, but if you're using 2 swappers, you can confuse the game. The game uses timing, so if 2 RFID tags, one top and one bottom, appear on the portal right at the same time or very close to the same time, then it auto pairs them up. So you can confuse Swap Force if you put 2 completed swappers on the portal at the same time. But that begs the question, how does the Swap Force portal itself play into this? Well, it's a common misconception that the portal was updated to warrant the technology used for swappers, with many videos covering the games and even the portals themselves claiming as such. But what if I told you this was all a big lie from Activision's marketing?
You've been living a lie. I saw the truth with my own eyes.
That does lead into another one of our questions, the question being, how many tags can be read by the portal at one time? Why was there a need to introduce a new portal for Swap Force? And how does the trap slot work? Is it just a smaller and less accessible NFC reader?
The Spyro's Adventure portal could only read 4 tags at one time. And for Swap Force, they needed it to be able to read more tags than that. So they redid the software and a little bit more engineering on the portal to increase it. And that was actually installed in the Giants portal. The Giants portal can read, I think, 8 tags. But the original Spyro's portals, the ones that were battery powered, could only read 4 tags. When they made Swap Force, that was a VV project, so we had a little bit less I was at Toys for Bob, and we had a little bit less input on that. We actually worked pretty well with them on Swap Force, but some things were done separate from us. And so they redesigned the plastics on the portal to make it less expensive. Eventually decided to go with gray rings because they wanted to be able to use the same portal for future games, which didn't happen, but that's the decision that was made at the time. That portal was very successful. It worked quite well, but it was a little bit expensive to manufacture. And so each subsequent portal, the engineering group would work on reducing the cost of the portal, which meant we could either lower the price of the games or be more competitive in the market with the other companies that came along afterwards, the Disney Infinity and Lego and Nintendo. They wanted to maintain some price advantage over them as well.
That's right, the portals for Swap Force weren't redesigned to warrant the swapping, but to cut down on production costs. That's why the portal is slimmer compared to the bulkier and more expensive to make SSA portal. In fact, you could even use the Spyro's Adventure portal to play with swappers in games like Superchargers. However, only one player would be able to play as a swapper. Since they have 2 tags, the 4 tag limit on SSA portals means that you would need to account for the tag in the second player Skylander and in the vehicle. Speaking of that limit, how many tags can the Swap Force portal read? Well, to account for the extra tag in swappers while still allowing players to use magic items, the software and engineering in the Swap Force portals were upgraded to read 8 tags. However, this portal wasn't the first to introduce this upgrade. Remember earlier when I mentioned the Giants portal getting a major upgrade from the first? Well,
so the Swap Force redesign of the portal, it wasn't to add in the 8 tags, it was just more of like an aesthetic thing and to cut down cost.
Largely, yes. I think the marketing people said it was to do 8 tags, but actually the Giants portal will do it as well.
Yeah, so the Giants portal was already able to read 8 tags. So why were players obligated to upgrade to the Swap Force portal, especially when Giants had a portal owners pack? Well, a big factor in that choice was company politics on whether portal owner packs should be offered.
Portal would do it as well. But there was a bit of tension there because one group of Activision wanted to make a portal-less version of the game for people who already had bought the previous version of the game. And they did, and then the department of Activision that didn't want to have the extra inventory set the pricing high enough so that it wasn't actually that attractive to get it, and that idea died.
So long story short, being forced to get the Swap Force portal wasn't because it was necessary to play Swap Force. It was because Activision duped us all.
Betrayal! What? Betrayal! Betrayed me!
Skylanders Trap Team is the first game where the portal received a drastic redesign in its function, with a slot for traps being introduced. Trap Team, while being a well-liked entry in the Skylanders series, is also known for its turbulent development and somewhat compromised final product. If you ever wondered why Trap Team wasn't as polished as Swap Force, it's because TFP couldn't settle on the final gimmick for the game. Throughout development, they cycled through a variety of gimmicks, with them losing time and progress with every gimmick that was scrapped.
It was challenging because to tell a good story or have these things kind of come together, it requires extra work from design and art. And I always tried to make it as non-invasive as possible, but to some degree, sometimes we needed assets and things to sell these things that's happening. And that was always tough too, because there was a schedule, time crunch. I mean, we turned Giants around in 11 months. And then for Trap Team, there was so long before we actually knew what the gimmick, as you say, was going to be for that one, so that once we got to building the levels around that story, there just wasn't as much time. So that was always the toughest part.
I remember, I think Toby was going to interject, Trap Team, they were originally AI buddies instead of you playing as them.
We realized the incredibly massive amount of work it is to have buddies do interesting things throughout every level. I think we saw
dynamically, yeah.
I was going to mention another game that did that, that had a female buddy that would go around and do a bunch of things for you. But then, anyway, that was...
Turns out AI is hard.
AI is hard.
Who knew?
I remember that, though. Yeah. That was really fun. There was a cool moment where, before we had settled on exactly how the AI was going to work, we basically hard-coded a green light with Chompy Mage following you around, and I had to do so many unique animations for Chompy Mage goes here and then does this. I was like, okay, how are we going to deal with that?
That might have been the prototype, actually.
Yeah. And the
really cool.
Yeah, and in every game we always had a green light or a prototype or something that was really cool, and it was like, can we end up doing all this? But I just remember, like, we get to every problem there, it's like, well, we can't quite figure it out, so we're just going to animate it and we'll figure it out later. And it was like, those started to stack up. Maybe we shouldn't do it.
It was very late too. It was about January or February of the ship year that we decided to have the trapped enemies be playable. And Pollyann deserves some credit for writing a long and passionate email to Paul Ritchie about how hey, we really should have them play them. I was a late hold. We were worried that the trapped characters were going to cannibalize sales of the toys, of the playable characters that we were selling as toys. That was one of the big concerns that some of us had anyway. But it turns out Skylanders fans want nothing more than more characters to play with and experience and own. So it worked out just fine.
I think the experience too. Yeah, like that demo was really strong for having like a passive character that was your ally and was doing cool stuff on the side, but it wasn't like an experience that was sustainable. Right. And then that's not even like the practicalities of it, but it was just like oftentimes that character would be doing cool stuff and it would be like close to off screen and you're not really paying attention to it, or it would be doing all the cool stuff for you. And then you're like, oh man, it turns out you actually, as a game, you want to play and be the active participant. And so that shift was a massive pivot for us internally, but I think it was ultimately the right decision for us. And we all kind of look back on it like, man, I wish we made that decision sooner.
This is reflected in the development of the Trap Team portal, which went through a variety of iterations. One of the more interesting ideas was using liquid paper and an LCD screen to show the villain players trapped on the portal. However, this idea was scrapped due to how expensive to produce these portals would have been, combined with the devs being unsatisfied with the results.
There were a bunch of things we did, particularly for Trap Team, that didn't make it into the game. At one point we were experimenting with the liquid paper stuff, it's electronic paper and liquid crystal displays that were going to show what was inside the trap on a little screen on the side of the trap. But it really was clear that we couldn't do that. It was, first of all, it was too expensive, and secondly, it wasn't very magical. It didn't really fit the feel of Skylanders.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So the whole idea of it in originally trapping, characters is like, well, how do we know that there's a character in here, right? We knew that we didn't want to just have another toy. How can you tell who's in there and what's the magic? How do you believe that there's something trapped in here, right? So obviously the first thing we thought of is like, okay, we'll put an LED screen, right? Actually put it in, it's like a Tamagotchi kind of thing, right? Like that's a good way to kind of show who I have in here, right? In this little device. So that was one of the first things that we did, and that ended up just would have cost too much money. We would have to have sold it for a lot of money, and it wouldn't make sense, right? Having all that tech into a little thing that you used to trap a villain. But we did actually do a prototype. There's a little screen, like I don't know, it's probably like an inch by half an inch screen, like a Tamagotchi kind of thing. Very few pixels that actually animated by hand and just have a character, with a few frames of animation to show that. And so, but that, that didn't work.
Another interesting Trap Team portal concept was one using some form of projection. The big man himself, Paul Reich, discussed this experiment in his interview with Teal Game Master.
Trap Team was this amazingly difficult prototyping phase because we knew we wanted to reverse the magic and suck characters from the world of Skylands into our physical world toys, our world toys. But we didn't know how to do that. And so we were experimenting with projectors and holograms and all of these things, which were crazy impossible to do.
So Toys for Bob were in a pretty hellish development cycle with Trap Team, and this goes beyond the portal as they were also having difficulty settling on gameplay mechanics. In fact, they didn't settle on the final gimmick of playable villains until January or February 2014, the same year they had to ship out the game. That was until TFB audio engineer and voice of Thumpback, Dan Neal, showed them a promising idea.
I've got to credit one of our audio engineers that it was absolutely genius when he did it the first time, and everybody came into the room and he played this little audio clip of the guy being captured into the trap, and it used the speaker in the Wii remote to play the sound of the villain being captured, and everyone went, oh, that's it.
But the brilliant thing of that is the audio team actually said, well, what if we can do audio? We're like, yeah, audio is not enough. We need something visual. So we didn't think much of it. And then a couple of days later, the audio guys just like, hey, you come over here, check this out. And they showed us exactly the transfer of going from the screen, the sound going into a portal with sound, which we already built, a portal with sound within, just because we kind of knew that might be the direction we might be going. So they did this prototype, and we just were all floored, just like, that works. I totally believe that the sound coming from that to the this little thing I'm sold. Like, that was magical.
TFB were sold on this idea. However, it wouldn't happen overnight, as Robert & Co. had to not only figure out how to add in an audio system to the portal, but also in a way that passed Nintendo's certification requirements.
We figured out how to add an audio system to the portal, which took quite a bit of effort and a lot of work getting past particularly Nintendo's certification requirements. There's a lot of engineering that goes in to get these things to work. And after months of work, the Trap Team portal was born. This portal is a favorite amongst fans and Robert himself, as it's able to be used in all 6 Skylanders games. And not to mention that cool light-piped ring. And what about that nifty little trap slot? How does that work? Well, rather than having its own reader, the slot actually uses the same one used by the portal. The trap slot has its own loop that's parallel with the main coil used for communicating with the tags and figures. In fact, Robert even said that the slot could read traps outside of the portal if you keep it close to the end of the white rim. Speaking of the traps, they also have RFID tags inside of them, but it was tricky for TFB to figure out how to get a tag inside of them. Like the portal, the traps also went through different incarnations, like one that looks like an actual cage.
That didn't work. So then we tried a cage, idea of a cage, like literal cage. So we did, cages.
So that's the nitty-gritty of how the Traptanium portal came to be. Now on to Skylanders Superchargers, one of the most contentious titles in the Skylanders series. Some people absolutely loved this game, while others really hated the focus on vehicles. I'm cool with Superchargers, I dig the car segments and story, but I feel that the roster is on the weaker side. Since the characters were all designed as bipeds in order to fit the driver motif, they lack the zanier shapes and sizes of the previous game's rosters. But that's neither here or there, because we're talking portals here. So what about that Superchargers portal? You may remember that I mentioned that the portals would be redesigned with lowering production costs in mind. This portal reflects that, as the LEDs featured in previous portals were removed in this one, but the portal still features a trap slot and is larger to have enough space for Skylanders and vehicles, even if this portal isn't compatible with Trap Team, oddly enough. However, there is a big caveat with this portal, a design issue only present in the Superchargers and Swap Force portals due to their smaller and lower designs.
There are some mechanical issues with making the portals smaller and lower, the way Swap Force did and then the way Superchargers did. Those portals will work fine if you're on a regular table, but if you're on a mirror surface table, or a metal table, they don't work anymore. You have to put them on a box or something to get them clear of the metal table.
I'd like to give a moment of silence to all Skylanders fans who want to play Superchargers on a metal or glass table. Skylanders Imaginators, the other most contentious game in the series. This game features a variety of odd design choices and a lot of familiar elements taking a hidden quality. Many of these issues stem from TFB having to work with an engine that was unfamiliar to them and the amount of time and resources dedicated to the Imaginator customization.
Which was the most difficult storyline to write for, and why?
I would say Imaginators, I think, because we were a combination of switching to a totally different tool set, spending so much modeling and animation time on the Imaginators themselves, which makes sense because you have to make all the different parts and everything. And actually, one of your questions even kind of relates to that I saw that you sent me, is why Skylanders as NPCs versus, the traditional NPCs that we would always do. That was part of the reason. That wasn't all the reason, but it was definitely part of it. Yeah, in that game, it was just going to be really hard to do. We couldn't, we were using new tools, so a lot of the cinematic stuff was, in some ways, I think it was a little bit more challenging, or at least it was different. We've already touched on it. Imaginators, I would say for sure. I wish we could redo. I wish we could fill those worlds with NPCs and life, not even just characters, but just ambient life in general. Like that was the hardest thing. And I don't know if it was a tools issue or a model. It could have just been pure modeling crunch because we had to redo everything for the new tools as well, plus all the Imaginator parts. It was a huge Herculean effort on the modeling and animation department. So that could have been where we were just limited. But I really wish those worlds felt as kind of rich, and worlds being like the levels you go to and places you go. I wish those could have felt more alive and magic and just Skylanders-y, To me, it just didn't feel as Skylanders-y. And it was kind of sad because it was the last one I worked on, and it's the only one I'm kind of not a fan of.
Looking back on it, do you think that there's anything that you want to change about the development of the game?
One of the things that we were trying to do was we knew that there was a chance that this was the last Skylanders game. So we had pretty much been told, if you don't make more money with this game, then this is the last one. So we intentionally wanted to leave a game with the audience that they could create their own characters. I think one of the things that we got into was it was mandated that we add digital purchases in-game, which was not a very comfortable thing to do. That necessitated a whole gacha design system in the different items that you could get to make your characters cooler. And I think that felt weird to us. If I could pull one thing out, it would have been the digital purchases. And then also, I think there's a general feeling that the adventure game wasn't as innovative as people wanted. There were a lot of ideas that we didn't put in there because of time constraints. I think that was hard for the level designers in particular. The character people got all the resources in Imaginators just because there was so much more to do there. And so I think the level people felt like they didn't get to tell the story of a scope that they wanted, and that the play experience wasn't as large as they wanted. So I think if I could have dialed the resources back to level development more, and I put a lot of time and effort, and so did Iwe, into the 3D printable characters, because I misjudged how rapidly that technology was going to emerge. I was using like Moore's Law, and it totally, 3D color printing is still pretty much where it was 6 years ago. And so I was really hoping that we could get to the point where we could turn around a Skylander toy as close to real time as possible. And so we were talking with all kinds of people who are doing future development on 3D printed toys. And we were looking at development systems that could print electronics straight into the toys. And I also really wanted to allow you to start getting personalized representations of your creativity. So I think that was a fine idea. It just didn't intersect with what people were interested in buying. It was too expensive, and it drained, I think, a lot of our focus. So I'm being super critical here. And, I love all our games. I'm proud of all of them. But if I could change the decisions that I made, it would all be about priorities. And I would have de-emphasized the priority on the 3D printing, the t-shirts, and the playable cards, and pour more back into level design and the narrative of that.
Moreover, the aforementioned cost-cutting from Activision was in full effect. Sales were slumping for Skylanders games, and most of the competition had already left the toys-to-life market. According to Robert, Activision were stuck with a bunch of Superchargers portals after that game underperformed.
Activision was in cost-cutting mode and wanted us to reuse the Superchargers portal because they had produced far more Superchargers portals than they sold of Superchargers, so they had a lot of excess plastic and metal lying around, and they refurbished some for Imaginators.
This resulted in many of these being refurbished and reused for Imaginators. Swap Force portals were also reused for this game. Now, this is a pretty underwhelming way to end the story, but Robert did mention something interesting about the Imaginators portal. Originally, an entirely new portal was designed for Imaginators, intended for use in a potential Imaginators 2.
We had a new generation portal built that would have gone with Imaginators, but Activision was in cost-cutting mode. But we had a portal design for Imaginators that if we'd done another game, we would have used on the next generation. We did have plans for Imaginators 2 and probably even an Imaginators 3, because there was plenty of room for exploring new shapes and new body forms to go in Imaginators. And as far as we could tell, 3D printing was just going to get better and better.
However, no prototypes or concepts of this next-gen portal have surfaced, at least none that I'm aware of. And that wraps up the evolution of the Portal of Power. For now, anyway. Maybe one day the series will make a comeback. Whether it's in 5 years or 15, the next generation of developers at Toys for Bob will have pioneers like Robert Leyland, Ai Huang, Paul Reich, and the brilliant team at Toys for Bob to thank for laying the groundwork. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time in God knows how long.